The White House is reportedly considering supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine. That's despite human rights groups urging both the Ukrainians and Russians not to use the controversial weapons, which are banned in many countries. Reporters have been asking the NATO Secretary General what he thinks of the possible move.
It is for individual allies to make decisions on the delivery of weapons and military supplies to Ukraine. So this will be for governments to decide, not for NATO as an alliance. We are faced with a brutal war, and we have to remember that this brutality is also reflected in the fact that we every day see casualties, and that cluster munitions is used by both sides, or cluster munitions are used by both sides. And Russia used cluster munitions in their brutal war aggression to invade another country, while Ukraine is using it to defend itself. The best way to end this brutal war is for President Putin and Russia to stop attacking another country. That's also the best way to stop all the suffering, the casualties, and the death we see caused by different types of weapons on the battlefield every day.
Before we go further into this, what are cluster munitions? Well, the missile canisters contain hundreds of smaller bombs, bomblets, if you will, that break apart in the air with a widespread, devastating impact. The International Committee of the Red Cross says that as many as 40% of these bomblets do not detonate. They fail to detonate, and that's what poses a risk to civilians, often decades later. Cluster munitions are banned by most countries. They're not banned, however, by the United States, by Ukraine, by Russia, as well as some other countries. Human Rights Watch accuses both Ukraine and Russia of killing civilians with cluster munitions. All right, our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, joins us now. Kimberly, what's the thinking at the White House on this?
Yeah, well, the thinking is that there has been a bit of a slowdown in terms of Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia. And as a result of that lag, what the feeling is that the supply of Western munitions is going to become increasingly scarce. And so there was a need for some sort of new boost, if you will, to this offensive. And so as a result, for months, there has been an ongoing debate between the Pentagon, the White House, Capitol Hill, in terms of what more could be done. And although it has been long controversial, the use of the cluster munitions, this is something that has been discussed. And just this week, it became clear that the decision had been made as recently as in the last 24 hours that announcement was imminent. So we're watching very carefully to see this come down. We are expecting it from the White House. As you point out, this is controversial given the fact that 120 countries have banned the use. But as you also point out, the United States is not one of them.
Yeah, cluster bombs are dangerous for civilians, ultimately. That's why they're so controversial. So why does the U.S. feel the need to send this particular type of munition as opposed to another one? Have they addressed that in any significant way?
Well, we're going to watch carefully. We have a briefing that is upcoming with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in the coming hours. It's also important to note that you'll remember when the Commander-in-Chief, also the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came into office. What he said was the foundation of his foreign policy was going to be human rights. Yet what we've seen time and again is sort of a blind eye being turned at different points in his presidency when it comes to human rights. And this would be another one of those intersections where there has been this deliberate choice to kind of look away and use something that is controversial and could deliberately harm humans and civilians. We know that the use of cluster munitions has a very high dud rate, if you will. Some statistics point out that it could be as high as 6%. We also know that the scarring of the landscape can be an impact for decades. That means that this failure rate, these golf ball-sized munitions can explode for often 10, 20 years or more, harming civilians. So in terms of the reason why they are being used, again, it comes down to the fact that the White House is really not sure where else to turn and is looking for something to give Ukraine that boost? These are the questions that are going to be posed to the National Security Advisor. Again, we're looking for that briefing coming sometime after about 17 GMT.
Kimberly, that's really interesting. You'll keep us surprised. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera's White House correspondent. Thank you. Now, Sarah Yager is the Washington director at Human Rights Watch. And Sarah, you're joining us from Washington, D.C. today. Your reaction to the U.S. possibly supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine?
And it's devastating for several reasons. One is that it has been a norm in the world that cluster munitions should not be used. The fact that Russia is using them is just another reason why they should not be used. They are absolutely awful for civilians. And of course, I think when legislators and policymakers here in the United States see the photos coming back of children with missing limbs, parents injured, killed by our own American cluster munitions, there's going to be a real awakening to the humanitarian disaster that this is.
I feel I know what you're going to say to this, but so the U.S. has made the argument that its cluster bombs have less unexploded ordnance. Again, we have to go back to how this works, right? This is dangerous because a lot of the little golf-sized munitions do not explode. They end up exploding later on unsuspecting civilians, including children, right? The U.S. says, well, our rate of duds is lower than some others and therefore less dangerous for civilians. Your reaction?
Well, they're still dangerous to civilians. They are still indiscriminate. And in fact, I would love to see the data from the Pentagon on where they tested these cluster munitions, because actually, if you test it on asphalt versus a field versus an ongoing war zone, the dud rate is going to be very different. And we actually don't know which variant they are using. There are lots of different variants of cluster munitions that the U.S. has in its stockpiles. So we have been asking for the data. Members of Congress have been asking for the data, and the Pentagon has not supplied it.
Yeah, also perhaps not completely surprising. You mentioned international norms. But actually, it's about 120 countries, give or take a few, but about 120 countries in the world that have signed the Convention on Cluster Bombs. So that still leaves a chunk of 70-plus countries that haven't, including the U.S. So they are not bound by any international convention not to use these.
They are not. They are bound, however, by congressional legislation that says, and for very good reason, that the United States will not transfer cluster munitions with over a 1% dud rate. That is why President Biden needed to sign the waiver. And the reason that Congress did that was because these weapons are so dangerous. And in fact, what I think we're going to see is that Ukraine has been fighting this conflict for the most part with the high moral ground, and they have been abiding by international law for the most part. Now they are going to use cluster munitions, and I think because cluster munitions really have not been used in the recent past by nations that believe in international law and humanitarianism, even in times of conflict, that we are going to see conflicts change after these are transferred.
Right. How do you continue to say you're on the right side of this conflict if you use this particular type of munition? You make very interesting points. Sarah Yager, Washington director at Human Rights Watch, thank you very much.
Thank you.